Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 7 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I drew a pretty interesting game against Aryan Tari with black, and I still hadn't lost a game, so I was still in pretty decent form, and the strong players kept coming. So in this one, my opponent was another 2600 Grandmaster. This time, actually, another Danish player by the name of Andersen. Now, this guy is actually pretty young, in his early 20s, close to my age, but a little bit younger. And he's actually the #1 active player in Denmark. Now, for many years, Peter Heine Nielsen was the #1 player, but as many of you may know, he's been a coach of Magnus Carlsen for quite some time, helping him with opening novelties and such. And Andersen has really carried the torch of young Danish talent. Now, there's also I'd be remiss if I didn't mention people like Jonas Bjerre, who's emerged on the scene, just got the GM title, or there's some other players as well that are quite decent in the youth system, but Andersen is the best, and very, very tough opponent. Now, it's actually kind of funny. I do know him, and we do know of each other. I'd actually never played him before, but I can recall actually one time we were in Iceland before the Reykjavik Open, and I think I was there a few days early or something, and we actually went swimming at some local pool in Reykjavik, and he's just a pretty nice guy, decent to get on with, just a reasonable dude. But of course, there are no friends on the board, and he seriously outrates me, and I was also trying to give the fight to him because I'm having a pretty good tournament. So, anyways, I was white, and let's get into it. So I'm with d4, typical for me, and Mess went knight f6, which is actually typical for him. Now, there's actually 3 main openings that he tends to play. One is the King's Indian, another is the Grunfeld, and the third is actually the Semi-Slav. And you might say, whoa, those are the most theoretical openings you can think of. And yes, it's true. Andersen actually is a very, very ambitious player, particularly in the opening, and is studying all lines very, very concretely. So, sometimes he might get into trouble in the opening if he, doesn't remember something. But in general, he knows a lot about the openings, and that's actually a part of what has pushed him to 2600 is his strong opening knowledge. It's very rare he gets a bad position from the opening. So I was actually thinking he'd probably play King's Indian or Grunfeld based upon knight f6, but again, you really never know until you see which d-pawn they push. So anyways, after knight f6, I went c4. I was not opting for a London system today. And after g6, I went knight c3. And this was the ultimate question. I wasn't messing around here. I wasn't playing knight f3 or g3 or delaying. I was saying, show me what you got. Are you going Grunfeld or King's Indian? This is the last chance to go Grunfeld. And lo and behold, he went for it. He went for d5, which, as we know, is the Grunfeld defense. So there are many moves here. cd5 is, the most popular, and then there are many lines there. But the line that I actually opted to go for was bishop g5. And bishop g5 is not the most popular way to handle the Grunfeld, but has its own interesting base of ideas. And it's actually something I'd employed twice before in the Road to Grandmaster series. I believe one time I played IM by the name of Rohan Ahuja, which was a video on this channel from much earlier in the series. I believe it was one of the Charlotte tournaments. And then I also played this opening in round 1 at the Grenke Chess Open, which was actually quite a disappointing game for me. It was a draw. Actually, both of my bishop g5 Grunfeld games were before this one were draws. But I thought, I had some new wrinkles, and I wanted to see how he would respond to them. The other thing I like about bishop g5, as opposed to some of the other Grunfeld lines, is that black has fewer responses. If you go for the cd5, knight d5 type positions, Black tends to have many, many different ways to set up his queenside pieces, whether he wants the knight on d7 or c6 after c5, whether he wants to put the bishop on b7 or not, and I just want to limit some of the options. So anyways, after bishop g5, Black played bishop g7, and this has actually been extremely trendy of late, and a move that I probably should have looked more in depth on because I didn't, to be honest, and this was something that kind of bothered me because I was expecting knight e4 right away, and I had some ideas against that. Now, with bishop g7, the point is it looks like d5 is hanging after I capture on f6, but the idea is that after bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, however I recapture the pawn, whether it's knight takes d5 or c takes d5, Black actually gets really good compensation for his pawn deficit. So, for instance, if c takes d5, I believe there are actually some positions where they actually just go c6. And I think there's some compensation here after d takes c6. And I don't even know if castles is a move, or no, maybe bishop takes d4. But I was vaguely familiar with there being some ideas in this position connected to c6 or even c5, and arguing that the dark square bishop along this diagonal is actually worth the pawn. And I didn't really want to go into something that's very, very, where the lines are very theoretically forcing, and also Black has the long-term positional trumps with the two bishops, and I hadn't investigated them deeply enough. So I decided to just develop with knight f3, although I must confess this was not the type of system I wanted to go for. And so this already threw me off just a bit. So after knight f3, now knight e4 was played, and I have a choice because now we're kind of back in the lines that I wanted to play. But the issue here is that they're actually slightly different than some of the ones I wanted to play. I'm not going to say exactly what it was, but there were some ideas in the Grunfeld where you don't rush to develop this knight to f3, and committing this knight to f3 basically gets into lines I hadn't looked at so deeply. So I'll leave that at that. Anyways, after knight e4, my bishop on g5 is challenged, and there are three ways to handle this position. Or three main ways, I should say. One is actually to play c takes d5. This was very, very popular like 20, 30 years ago. And the point is that, knight takes e3 isn't really super desirable because after b takes d3, White's bishop is still bearing down on the e7 pawn, even if Black recaptured on d5. The move that's played here is knight takes g5. And then after knight takes g5, Black actually goes e6 and recovers his pawn because the knight on g5 is hit and the pawn on d5 is hit. And there's sometimes they play e3 and go for this type of position. But in my opinion, Black is actually completely fine here because essentially Black already has the two bishops, and the Carlsbad structure is actually proven to be quite sound. So, I could employ this minority attack plan, but given the fact that Black already has the two bishops, I'm just not buying it. And that's one idea. Another idea after e takes d5, after e6, is actually go queen d2. And the point is that you defend this knight, and after e takes d5, there's queen e3 check, which actually forces the move king f8 because there's no way to effectively block on the e-file. If you play bishop e6, you lose material. You play queen e7, you lose the d5 pawn. But after king f8, Black is actually quite decent here and has this typical plan of challenging the knight with something like h6, sometimes winding up moving the king to g7. And the queen is actually in the way of, the pawn on e3, and then in turn the bishop on f1, or the pawn on e2 trying to get to e3, and the bishop on f1 trying to develop. So White has to make some moves, rearranging his pieces so that they make sense. And again, Black has the two bishops, so I'm not totally convinced that White should even be doing this. So that's one option with c takes d5. Another option, probably the most popular option, is actually bishop h4. And the idea here is that it's actually a legitimate pawn sacrifice because after knight takes c3, b takes c3, and d takes c4, White typically, allows the c4 pawn to stay in the game and tries to go like e3 and rook b1 and essentially play fairly actively to kind of justify, the setup. And the concept in a lot of lines is that black has actually relinquished a little bit of control of the center. So white typically tries to press forward in the middle and argue that the double pawns aren't such an issue. Although I will say here, Peter Svidler with the black pieces has shown in many, many games of his that these Grunfeld positions are extremely resilient for black. And in many lines, he could even just try to hold on to the pawn and, claim some type of long-term edge. Of course, I can go queen a4 check here. This is an option. I'm hitting at the c4 pawn and winning it back right away. But these types of positions are not really very challenging for black because after you recover this pawn, the queen's actually quite misplaced and often is hit later with a b6 and bishop a6. And there's some lines here where, I drew the diagonal a little bit funny, but there's some lines here where the bishop and on f1 and the queen on c4 are quite vulnerable, and sometimes white has to castle artificially after a bishop takes f1, king takes f1 because of this b6, bishop a6 idea. So that didn't really appeal to me either. And the move that I actually went for was one that I hadn't. Well, actually, before I get into that move, another line that's possible here is actually h4. And this is actually quite exotic, but hey, it seems in many openings now pushing the h-pawn is quite playable. The idea here is that after knight takes g5 and h takes g5, white has pretty interesting counterplay on the h-file, and again, white still has the pressure in the center with the pawn on d5. But even here, I think black is quite reasonable play. Just having the two bishops is again a long-term asset that's good. So I didn't go for any of those three moves. Instead, I went for a fourth possibility, which is bishop f4. And the idea here is a little bit more conservative. The point is that you just keep this bishop on a nice active diagonal. You're pressuring c7 as well. And after knight takes c3, b takes c3, d takes c4 is not as attractive because the bishop's on already on a decent diagonal challenging c7, so I could go queen a4 check and take on c4, but even if I don't, after e3 I can go knight e5, and the bishop is supporting that knight, so I'm not mangling my structure if there's a bishop takes c5 sighting. So essentially this position this bishop f4 move kind of discourages d takes c4 and tends to lead to fairly tepid lines, if you will. And that's kind of what happened, because after bishop f4 and knight takes c3, b takes c3, Mess played c5. And this is kind of the main line in this particular variation. The point is that with the bishop on f4 instead of g5, it makes sense to kind of break things open here because there's no pressure against the e7 pawn. So c takes d5 doesn't really concern black as much as in the other lines where the bishop is on g5. So after c5, I did go e3 first just to reinforce this center and also invite black to take the c4 pawn and help me develop. Of course, he didn't do that. Mess castled. And I went c takes d5 now because there's no great way to keep the tension longer. I mean, if I play bishop e2, I'm not really buying it. So I think taking on d5 makes sense. After c takes d5, c takes d4 was played. Interesting intermediate move. If you take on d5 right away, there might be some idea with me playing c4 on my own at some point, but I'm not entirely convinced. Maybe there's some lines where rook b1 is also a little bit annoying. Go figure. C takes d4 was played, and I took with the c pawn so that I wouldn't have this backward c pawn. And now queen takes d5 was played, and I went bishop e2. And bishop e2 is a little bit modest, you could say, but the point is that, I essentially am kind of prophylactically guarding against bishop g4. And in some lines, frankly, I don't actually want to exchange the light-squared bishops right away. So if I put on d3, bishop f5 might come fairly quickly, whereas at least on e2, I can keep some pieces on the board. So after bishop e2, black went knight c6. I castled, and now bishop f5 was played. And this has all been played before, by the way, dozens of times. This is a position that's been seen many times before. And really, it's an interesting position because I have a pawn majority in the center, but black has a pawn majority on the queen side. And so it's kind of a question of whose pawn majority is going to matter more. And yeah, I actually say I think in the short term, the central pawn majority might be something that matters more, but in the long term, the queenside majority is a greater asset. And so it's really important for me here to kind of really show an important idea before that becomes a problem. Because again, if you just imagine it to be a pawn endgame, there are circumstances where the king would have to run to the queen side to support the outside pass pawn, or to stop the outside pass pawn. And outside pass pawns are always a little bit more challenging to defend because they require your attention on one edge of the board. So yeah, that's something I was already a little bit aware of. And the other thing that's a little bit tricky with having this type of structure is that the A2 pawn in many lines can be a little bit vulnerable because it's by its lonesome, right? It's there's no other pawn near it, and so that presents itself as another challenge to deal with this this pawn dynamic. So just things to be aware of. After bishop f5, I wanted to connect my rooks. Note black has done so already, and so I went queen a4. And here black actually went queen a5, and this has actually still all been played before. I think about a dozen times already. And there's basically two moves in this position. One is to take on a5, and the other is to play queen b3. I took on a5, which is completely playable and stuff, but I think it kind of helps black get what they want in terms of getting this knight to a5, getting some counterplay on the c4 square and the c file, and also getting closer to an ending where black's trumps usually matter a little bit more. So in hindsight, I think queen b3 would be a little bit more sensible. Now, even in this position, black has the move queen b4, and this can be a little bit annoying because the queens typically do come off the board. But I think in some circumstances, queen takes b3 and a takes b3 is a little bit better than the exchange on a5. And the reason for that is if the pawn is on b3, there are circumstances where I have counterplay on the a file, the half-open a file with my rook, as well as the half-open c file. And that's not necessarily the same thing if they're exchanged on a5. And the other thing is I have better coverage of the c file, and particularly the c4 square, because my pawn would be on b3. So again, let's just say like rook fc1 now, queen takes b3, a takes b3. And you can see here that all my pieces are, decently active, and black will probably need to play a6 at some point just to make sure the pawn on a7 is completely secure. And yeah, I think this would just be a slightly better version. Although even in these lines, you can see the b pawn might be a little bit vulnerable at some point, maybe with bishop e6 or knight b4. Or, I don't know. I just think the pawn on b3 is a little bit more secure than on a2. Anyways, I did take, and after knight takes a5, it's very important that I'm quite quick, because if I do nothing, black will kind of, control the c file. So now I went rook ac1, trying to, play on the c file a little bit, get something going there. Another option, and maybe just as good, is actually rook fc1. The point is that this rook might actually serve a purpose on the a or b file later. Obviously now it doesn't make sense to put on b1, but at some later juncture it might make sense. Whereas after rook ac1, this rook on f1 is definitely not doing anything there. So maybe a question of wrong rook, but doesn't change anything too significantly. After rook ac1, black went rook ac8. Again, makes sense, challenging on the c file. And now I went knight d2, which is a kind of an important regrouping in this system, because I need to, first of all, vie for the c4 square. It's a very important square. Potentially transfer my knight over to the c file is also nice. And last but not least, my bishop in many lines really wants to be on the h1, a8 diagonal, from which it can challenge the b7 pawn. And sometimes just force a weakness to b6, where the light squares would be a little bit sensitive. So that was basically the idea with this setup. Last but not least, I should say that the knight d2 also facilitates g4 as a potential idea, chasing this bishop off this diagonal. The bishop on f5 is extremely annoying for white to contend with because it just controls all of the really important business squares on the queen side. So anyways, after knight d2, black went knight c6 back, which is actually really, really good choice because now this knight is actually eyeing b4 as an avenue to challenge the a2 pawn, challenge d3, remember one of these important squares, and I really have to be quite proactive about dealing with this, and so I went for the move g4. And the idea here was to just push this bishop off this diagonal. After g4, black went bishop e6, challenging my pawn on a2, and this is a reasonable move, but I actually was kind of okay with this because I like the fact that this pawn on e7 wasn't really challenging my bishop or my pawn on d4, and a lot of lines. One of the other key ideas when the knight comes back to c6 and the knight on f3 is left that post is actually this e5 break, which challenges the bishop on f4 and the pawn on d4 and rips open this diagonal for the g7 bishop. But again, you can see here how black's moves in many respects actually come a little bit easier than white's, and this is actually a position where I'm not so sure it's something that the white player should be super enthusiastic about playing. But anyways, after g4, bishop e6. Now I went a3, just covering the a2 pawn. But you can see here that this a pawn's already a little bit of a target. It's already getting hit a little bit. And, again, being by itself might present itself as a problem. Black now went bishop d5. And this is actually the first new move in the position. So, again, all the moves up to this point, including a3, had been played before, according to my database. And then the move that had been played every single time after a3 in this position had been rook fd8. And there were some games with like rook fd8, bishop f3, and bishop d5, and more draws than anything else. But so a few wins for black. I think one win for white. But Mess actually played bishop d5 here, and I was actually on my own quite some time ago. But it's important to point out that this bishop d5 move was actually a mistake. Now, it's not a significant error or anything, but it does give me the opportunity to play a move that I didn't play. I actually proceeded with bishop f3 anyway, because, I couldn't really conceive of the difference between this and rook fd8. But it actually turns out that after bishop d5, I have this very, very important move, rook c5. And the point is now, after rook fd8, I actually have rook fc1, and I'm the one that's actually playing on the c-file. So this is actually a very, very important move and just a missed opportunity for me to really kind of try to seize the initiative here. Now, one of the important things with this doubling of the rooks is you can see there's no square the knight can go to just exchange everything on c8. And a move like b6 would actually be a blunder because I think I can just play rook takes d5 and bishop f3 at the very least. Maybe even bishop a6 is stronger. But I think both those moves should be okay for white. And even if maybe taking on d5 and giving up the exchange is not even something I need to do, I can start with rook c2. And then you can see here bishop a6 is a threat. And again, you can see when b6 is played, some of the light squares become a little bit sensitive. So this opportunity to kind of double really quickly on the c-file based upon the bishop being unprotected was something that I could have considered. Instead, after bishop d5, I went bishop f3, and now bishop takes f3 was played. And I actually thought this exchange would help me because I thought after bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, now the light square bishops were off the board, I'd have, a little bit more clarity on some of these light squares in the center, which were bothering me just a little bit and stopping me from really doing anything with my central pawn majority. But it actually turns out that the absence of the light squared bishops actually helps black more than it helps white. And I think the reason for that is that the light squares on the queen side, particularly on the B and C files, become really, really sensitive. And because I have this, basically this pawn by itself on a3, it's kind of important that I get some counterplay on, on the queen side, but I'm not really getting that without the light squared bishop. So this exchange, although, not some type of losing mistake, it does, hurt me a little bit, make my task more difficult. So anyways, after bishop f3, knight f3, black went rook fd8. And I think this is a good move. In some lines, the rook might shift over to the queen side via d5. But you could just see here that I'm not really able to push or mobilize my central pawn majority. At the end of the day, d5 is not a move anymore, right? e4 is not possible because d4 would be hanging. And so I have to kind of play this constraining strategy with my pawn majority. But it's hard to figure out what was my active plan going to be. And black's active plan is actually quite clear. He could entertain rerouting the bishop to f8, playing e6, challenging a3. Again, if the pawn on a3 is lost for some reason, I'm probably losing the game because these would be two connected passers. And there's also knight a5, knight c4 as an option for black to, again, challenge for the c file and maybe pressure the a pawn even more. So already here I was quite uncomfortable and burning a lot of time because I was trying to figure out what is my active plan. And it was really hard for me to come up with the right thing. So anyways, after rook fd8, I now went king g2, which is kind of a prophylactic move in the sense that I get my king off the first rank, but also in some sense a waiting move because I'm not really sure what to do. And it's not something you want to have where you're not sure what your course of action should be, and you're basically in a position where there's a lot of things that can happen. So after king g2, Mess went e6 and continued with one of these kind of obvious plans, honestly. Again, black's plans are a little bit clearer than white's here. So maybe one flaw with e6 is that some of the dark squares around the king are a little bit weakened. I was hoping at some point I'd be able to make use of this diagonal being a little bit more sensitive, but easier said than done. So after e6, I actually went rook c2. This is actually a slight mistake. Instead, rook c4 would be a lot better. And the reason for that is that if bishop f8, I can actually go a4 and kind of support the a4 pawn horizontally and prepare to double. One thing to be aware of here is that if knight a5, again, vying for the c file, it's very important that I don't take on c8, but instead play the move rook c7. And the point here is now I'm going to play rook fc1 and double on the c file and maintain control. And note that the knight can't move to c6 and come back because b7 is hanging. And you can't take on c7 because after bishop takes c7, there is a skewer of the rook and knight on this diagonal. So that would not be something you want to do. And again, if rook d5, after all that, I have e4. So let's say rook c7, bishop c7, rook d5, now e4, and black has no square for this this rook on the fifth rank, and black will lose material. So because of that, rook c4 would have been pretty effective. Instead, I went rook c2. And now after bishop f8, I already have some problems because, again, a3 is now something that needs tending to. And if I go a4 in this particular circumstance, knight b4 comes into the game, knight d3 is a legitimate option. And at the very least, black is, controlling the c file now because I can't double. So, yeah. So anyways, rook c2, bishop f8. And I actually went bishop g5 here, challenging the rook on d8. I thought that if I'm at least able to kind of, maybe force the rook to d7, that would be something that'd be a nice outcome for me. But Mess wisely played rook e8 and kept the rooks connected so that he can kind of, vie for the c file once he moves his knight. I now went rook b1, trying to kind of defend actively or play actively so I don't have to defend the a3 pawn directly, because making a move like rook a1 or even rook a2 just seemed really depressing. And again, a4 didn't seem super attractive right now because knight b4 hit my rook on c2. So I thought rook b1 made some sense attacking the b pawn and kind of loosening the construction on the queen side. But again, after b6, black's actually effectively covering this pawn. And you can see here that now, again, that the light squared bishops are off the board, it doesn't really matter so much that these squares are a little sensitive because I don't really have a great way to take advantage of them. And again, now you can see the a3 pawn is a problem. I went rook b3 to defend this pawn. Very, very awkward. Typically, it's a lot more valuable if you have your rooks kind of connected than split, and you can see here my rooks are split. A better move would have been rook c3, and there's a line that goes, the idea is that I just double my rooks on the c file, and there's a line that goes knight e7, rook takes, and now a4. And amazingly, I can hold this one because I essentially try to play a5 and just sack the pawn for activity. So if a move like rook c2, I actually take on e7 preemptively to kind of deal with knight d5, take c3 type stuff. And after bishop e7, go a5. And by liquidating or jettisoning my a pawn for activity, I actually get enough counterplay to hold this one. My knight can come to e5, challenge f7. I'm definitely going to win a7 and have my rook behind the pawn, which is something that you always want. Rook behind the pawn is always a good thing. And it's a position that can be held quite easily. But you can see how it's already kind of clear I have to be quite active to hold the game because the queenside pawn majority is the biggest factor in the position. After b6, I went rook b3, and then black went h6, which is, I think, a really nice move, just trying to force my bishop off this diagonal. I went bishop f4 back. This is actually another mistake. Instead, the move rook bc3 needed to be played just to kind of, again, vie for this control on the c file. There's a long line here. After bishop takes a3, knight takes g5. It seems that black is like totally winning here with the connected passers, but my rook is coming to c7, and I'm able to get some counterplay. But again, even though the computer, will hold this, and again, rook b7 is an extremely important move, actually. One that from far away is almost impossible to see, but the point is that with rook b7, you actually hold up the this majority from it mobilizing, because now the rook is frozen, because then the a7 pawn would be hanging, and the a pawn would appear to be frozen because then the b pawn would be hanging. And so this would be something that where it seems like white is just, holding. But even this position, white has to be very precise, taking this pawn, coming back, defending passively. Again, you can see this is like a 10 to 15 move line where white has to play fairly precisely to hold. And quite frankly, I did not see the idea with rook c7. I can understand this first part of the line, doubling and trading the rook for knight, but to play rook c7 in this particular position and then rook b7 is, really, really good. It requires a lot of foresight. So anyways, after h6, bishop f4, black now went g5, pushing me back further. I went bishop g3. And now knight e7, and now the operations on the c file have begun for getting counterplay because black is the one manning the c file. And again, the question is really, can I mobilize my central pawn front? And so far the answer has been no. So after knight e7, I went rook cb2, stepping off of the c file, and this is a kind of sad move to make, but I thought the alternative of taking on c8 was just a bit dodgy because my rook here is still kind of out of play and just a purely defensive piece, and I just thought that black would be able to step into the diagonal and make something happen here. But actually turns out that this would be better than what I did. I can play e4 here, take away the d5 square, and then apparently this is a position that, where black is actually not really that much better, but it just appears to me that black is the one that's playing for something. I have, basically 4 pawn islands and, just really strange looking pieces. So not a huge fan. So after rook cb2, knight d5 was played, and Black is, starting to outplay me. Essentially getting all this activity. I really need to be quite active with counterplay, and I was trying to be active, so I went h4, trying to challenge this g5 pawn, get some counterplay. Black now went bishop e7, which I think is a good move, holding the g5 pawn in place, because if you take on h4 after bishop takes, the h6 pawn might be a target for me later in the game. So I think it makes sense to kind of make sure it's not the case. And after bishop e7, I actually took on g5, releasing the tension. And this is actually another mistake. Instead, a4 would have actually been more precise. And the idea is that after knight c3, now I take on g5 and actually, again, play a5 and jettison this pawn for activity. And you actually can see this theme. This is the second line I've shown where a5 is a key move, sort of trading that pawn or opening the b file for my rooks. And the point is here that after b5, I actually can give up an exchange, and I have pretty reasonable, play here because the pawn on g5 is under fire. Maybe I have rook b7 to attack a7. And if the a pawn comes off the board, I think this is quite an easy hold because my pawn structure is really good, and my bishop and knight are, quite stable here. So the rooks will have a hard time entering into the white camp. Note that the knight is also controlling the g1 square. So, yeah, this is the type of position that, I think I probably hold in my sleep, but you have to find these active moves, and liquidating the a pawn was really a priority that I didn't make happen. Instead, I took on g5, and then after takes, I went knight e5 and sought counterplay in the center. But there are really no squares going forward that really make sense for my knight, so it's kind of a phantom knight there. Black now went f6, actually challenging my pawn or my knight on e5. And amazingly here, the best move is actually knight g6. Good luck finding that in a game. I thought this move made no sense at all because of bishop d8, and it seems like my knight is just trapped. But it actually turns out here miraculously that after e4, there's no square this knight can really go to where I can't exchange it for my knight. And the point is that if you go to c7, which seems like the square where you do threaten king g7 next, I actually have rook c2 pinning this knight to the rook on c8. And it actually turns out here that white's the one that's better, because after king f7, now d5 all of a sudden is extremely strong. And again, good luck trying to find this over the board, but just showing you knight g6 was a good move. Again, actually, bishop d8 is actually not the best. Rook c4 is better. And after knight e7, black still has an advantage based upon the queenside pawn majority. But very interesting line. After f6, I went back. I played knight d3, and I thought in some lines maybe knight b4 would be desirable, trying to trade these knights, maybe give me counterplay on the a file. And now black went rook e d8, which I think is actually a pretty good move, kind of preempting my knight b4 idea. The point is now that if I take on d5, he can recapture with the rook and still get counterplay on a5. I played knight b4 anyway, thinking that trading pieces was the road to salvation. And now rook c4 is played, and you can see there's some challenge to my knight on b4. I now went king f3, just trying to centralize my king a little bit, activate it, make it a player in this position. And now black went king f7. And here I played king e2, trying again to bring my king closer to the queen side, help in the defense of the queen side. And now rook d c8 was played. And we were very, very close to approaching the time control. In this tournament, you got an extra 30 minutes and move 40. And I just couldn't really see any real active way to keep the tension. So I actually took on d5. But this is actually extremely risky because after e takes d5, now my pawn structure is kind of fixed. I don't get the chance to make use of my majority here because the d5 pawn is, kind of holding e4 on lock. And again, a3 is a problem. So very, very unpleasant position to defend, even going into a position where we did get 30 extra minutes. After he takes d5, I went king d3. It actually turns out the better move, or not maybe the better move, but another move that was playable was actually f4, trying to trade these pawns. But after bishop d6, you can see my bishop on g3 is very vulnerable. So after king d3, king e6, I actually went f3, trying to kind of liquidate this massive d5 pawn. I'm playing e4 myself. But you can see after f3, I weakened the whole second rank. And also my bishop on g3 is less stable. So now black kind of took his chance and went rook a4, vying for the a3 pawn, but also entertaining an invasion on c1. I went bishop e1, which is extremely passive-looking move to make, but it's actually the best move in the position. And the point is actually to try and trade these bishops with bishop b4. And the other idea is that if you take on a3, this would be premature because I can recapture and then go rook a2, and the a7 pawn is hanging. So bishop e1 is actually a pretty good move. And note that if you switch the move and go start with bishop a3, now rook a2 wins a piece because of this pin. So bishop e1, rook c1 was played, and this is a move I expected, hitting my bishop on e1. And now I went bishop b4, trading those bishops. Yeah, bishop takes b4 is played, a takes b4, and now rook a1. And yeah, this is actually a very, very critical position because I've done quite well to trade the bishops, given that my bishop was not particularly secure anymore on g3 after I played f3. But I've not actually played e4 yet and managed to trade the d-pawn and relieve the congestion in my position. And here now e4 doesn't make, I didn't think it made a huge ton of sense because the king could come to d5 and be quite secure. So this is actually a critical position of the game, and really kind of determines how white can defend. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out what the best move for white is here. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and kind of weigh the options here. Actually, turns out that the best move in this position is actually b5. And this is not a move I played, but I could see in hindsight why it's good. The reason it's so good is because, first of all, it fixes the queenside pawns, right? So if you try to play a5 now, I can take with en passant and get counterplay on the b file. And so I kind of limit the majority here. The other reason is that I actually limit the king's mobility and give my rook a potential anchor on c6 or c7. And so it actually turns out here that I can now try and vie for the c file with rook c3 and get the counterplay needed to hold the game. And so now if you try to go rook f1 and go after my f-pawn, this was the thing that I was concerned about, now I can go rook h2. And amazingly, I have this idea of putting my rook on h7 and then putting the other rook on c3 and just holding. And if rook takes f3, rook c3 now, and this is the way you do it, because now actually this rook can come to c6 with check. This one can come to h7, and with rook c6 and rook h7, I will draw the game because there'll be some mating ideas with the king potentially being on g6. And yeah, there's no way that black's king can actually escape the checks with my rooks invading. And this is actually the key idea that I missed. Instead, I started with the move rook c2. And, this is a reasonable move from the standpoint that I'm trying to, get to c6. But actually, this rook should try to get to the h file, and this one should get to the c file because, again, it can't get to the h file. So that's kind of one of the key differences. And it also gives the option for black to actually trade the rooks now, which he actually did with rook takes c2. So after rook takes c2, king takes c2, black now went rook f1. And you can see in this particular version, it's not as good because my rook on b3 is still passive, and it looks like black's about to win a pawn. I went rook a3, challenging the a pawn. And after rook takes f3, I went king d3, defending the e3 pawn before going for a7, because if I take a7, the position will probably be lost, because after rook takes a7, rook takes e3. Well, if rook b7, there's actually rook e4, and after rook takes b7, rook takes b6, king f7, rook takes g4 will be a threat, and two connected pass pawns is typically enough to win, and this b pawn I don't think is fast enough. So definitely need to secure the e3 pawn, so that's why I went king d3. And now rook f1 was played, which is actually a really good decision, because if you play the move rook g3, I can take now, and after rook takes g4, go rook a6. And in this particular version, I'll hold this one because I'm going to take on b6. The material will be level again, and they won't be two unassailable connected pass pawns, because my e3 pawn will be able to challenge the f pawn. So this would be holdable. So rook f1 is a good move. And after rook takes a7, rook b1 was played, and this actually ensures that black will be a pawn up in these proceedings, because the b4 pawn can't be defended forever, because if I run to defend it, then he's going to attack the g pawn, and so this actually is a good decision. I went rook c7, giving up the b4 pawn and trying to play for activity. And now after rook b3 check was played, I went king e2, and rook takes b4 is played. And this is actually the critical position of the game, because this position is still a draw with best play, but it requires extreme precision. Now, actually, in the move before king e2, I actually had the option to go to d2 or e2, right? Both squares protect the e3 pawn. And it actually turns out that the best square is actually king d2. And the reason for this we will see as a recurring theme in the rest of this endgame, but it's actually extremely important for my king to remain close to the b pawn that's going to start advancing. And this was actually a misjudgment on my part. I thought that the king would actually be more secure, that drawing chances would be much better with my king on f3. I thought from f3 it's shielded from checks. The pawn on e3 is protecting it. It's also observing potential pawn breaks that give black another pass pawn on the king side. But it actually turns out that it's actually near the b file that the king needs to be to slow down the pawn advance. And we're going to actually see this happen. But just to show you a snippet of this variation after king d2, captures on b4, rook c6 check, king e7, rook c7 check. If king d6, rook f7 is important, attacking the pawn on f6. Now king e6 needs to be played, and then rook c7 again. And after rook b2, king d3, b5, rook c6 check. This is actually the key point. The point is that you keep the king close enough to the b pawn so it's not completely running away with itself to become a queen, and you harass the king enough where it actually can't defend both d5 and f6. So because of that, essentially black will have a problem advancing the b pawn, because if b4 is played, now rook b5 becomes an option, and d5 and f6 just can't be held. And then after the rook wins one of those pawns, it's actually in time to come back to the b file. Now, what I did doesn't allow for this, and we're going to see why in a little bit. All right, so anyways, let's back this up a little bit. So rook b3 check, king e2, rook takes b4, and now rook c6 check. And here's actually already there's going to be a little bit of a difference. Is giving checks on the c file actually does not keep the rook far enough away from the king where it's actually able to constantly harass, because actually the king's actually able to step up to e7 and then d6, and when a tempo on my rook, we're forcing it to move away. And that would not be the case if the rook was on the b file. If the rook was on the b file, the king couldn't come close and encroach and attack this rook that's on the c file, because it'd be one file too far away from the black king. And this actually becomes really important, because now after king e7, if I go rook c7 check, there's just king d6. And if rook f7, there's king e6. So that's actually one kind of important point. And even here, rook b7 would be an option, but then I'd have to see again that it's important for me to check from the b file, which I did not actually comprehend. Now, okay, so after rook c6 check, king e7, I actually went for the move king f3. And again, this is based upon a misunderstanding about where the king should be. The king should be on d3, where it's close enough to the b pawn that it doesn't become a really strong runner, and I underestimated this. So king d3 would be a lot stronger. If rook b3 check, king d2, rook b1, king d3, just shuffling on the d file, and then when b5 is played, checking on c7, and then going to the b file. And here, this position would just be holdable, because you can see here I can challenge d5, take that pawn, and if b2, my king is close enough to the b1 square, where if rook d1, I just go king c2, and my rook and king will stop it from queening. And of course, if the rook runs away to g1, I'll just take it, and we'll have a 2 versus 2, which is just a draw. So this is actually the key thing, keeping the rook on the b file, not on the c file. Yeah. So anyways, after king f3, rook b1 was played, and I win rook c7 check. King d6, very important, challenging my rook. And now I need to, go rook b7 and try to make hay of that position. But I go rook f7. And after king e6, now rook b7, b5, and the problem here is that now, trying to check on b6, the king can actually hide on g6, and then the b pawn can run, and the king in f3 is just a little bit too far away. So I did check there, king e7, and then king e2, but this particular version, now my king is trying to run back to the b pawn, but it's just too far advanced, and this is actually why the position is lost. Again, it was so important to keep my king on d3, because in this particular version, I'm not getting counterplay on d5 fast enough, because the b pawn is now a runner that my king has to run back to attend to. So now king d3, b3, and now rook b7 check, king e6, rook b6, king e7, and we repeated a few times, and then the king darted away. And the point is that b2 becomes somewhat of an idea. f5 becomes an idea. And after rook e7, now b2 is a huge problem. And he actually gives up the b pawn, jettisons that pawn, gets the g pawn in return, and just wins the game. And the issue is that I can get the d5 pawn, but if I trade the d pawn for the e pawn, and he already has 2 connected passers, it's just a lost position. And so let's step back here and ask, okay, because after king g6, I did go rook e7. Why can't I, do something different? Well, the issue is no matter what I do, rook g1 takes g4, it becomes an idea. So, yeah, this becomes actually the huge problem. So, for instance, let's say rook b6. Now b2, king c2, rook g1, takes b2, takes g4, and this position is just winning because the g pawn is just too much of a factor. And again, no rook d6, rook e4 is decisive. So my king would have to go to, I think, c3 to try and hold this one. Yeah, it's not holdable. This position is lost. I think moving the rook and pushing the g pawn will be just finito. So, yeah. So basically, now I win rook e7, b2 is played, I win king c2, but I knew the position was lost now, because after rook g1, I win on b2 and I secure the e pawn, but after rook takes g4, king c2, I'm one move too late getting back to the pawn, and now rook e4 just allows black to even trade to a pawn endgame because he is a 3 versus 2, which is decisive. So actually, after this move, rook e4, I actually resign, because obviously if I move the rook away, he takes on e3. So if I go here, this position is just losing for me. And if I take, this position is just lost, and this king can just walk to d5, and then he can play f4, which is a very important breakthrough, and it's just over. So after the move rook e4, I resigned. I was very, very upset after losing this game, understandably so. I thought that I never really got into it. I was not able to put enough pressure on mess with the white pieces, and I think I got thoroughly outplayed in the middle game because it was clear that black's queenside pawn majority was the trump in the position that was really the most important factor, and I didn't manage to get my kingside majority going. I didn't really understand the position particularly well, and then even though I defended pretty well before the time control, I didn't show enough tenacity in the rook endgame to draw it. And I think, on a better day I might have. I think many strong players would have held this ending quite easily. I just wasn't able to find the right plans, and just a really tough day at the office. But hey, even after this game, I was now on 5 out of 7. That's nothing to scoff at. This is the first loss that I'd had, right? I had 4 wins, 2 draws, and now a first loss. And I needed to respond. It's when you lose, it's when you deal with adversity that you have an opportunity to show what you're made of. And I was going to have that opportunity in the next round. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.